Eleanor clutched her worn carpet bag tighter as she walked down the dusty main street of Silver Creek, Colorado. The morning sun cast long shadows between the wooden buildings, but she barely noticed the beauty of the day. Tears rolled down her cheeks, leaving clean trails through the dust that had settled on her face during her walk from home. 3 days had passed since that terrible conversation with her father. 3 days since her world had crumbled around her feet like the old mine shafts that dotted the hills around their small town. She could still hear his broken voice echoing in her mind, see the defeat in his shoulders as he sat at their kitchen table with papers scattered before him like fallen leaves. "Eleanor, my dear girl," he had said, unable to meet her eyes, "I've made a terrible mess of things. The mine investments, they've all gone bad. We owe more money than I can ever hope to repay." She had known things were difficult. The meals had grown smaller over the past months. Her father had sold her mother's jewelry piece by piece. The pretty dresses she once wore to church socials had been replaced by simple work clothes that could be mended again and again. But she never imagined it was this bad. "How much do we owe, Papa?" she had asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Nearly $3,000, he whispered. "The bank is threatening to take the house. Mr. Henderson at the general store won't extend any more credit. And there are other debts. Gambling debts that can't wait." Eleanor's heart had sunk. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. In their small mining town, most families were lucky to see $100 in cash during a whole year. "But I've found a solution," her father continued, and something in his voice made her stomach turn cold. "Mr. Cornelius Whitmore has offered to pay all our debts." Every penny, she knew that name. Everyone in Colorado knew Cornelius Whitmore. He owned vast ranches in California, had interests in mines and railroads, and was said to be richer than some kings. But she also knew the whispered stories about him. How his ranch hands quit after only a few months, how his housekeepers always seemed to have accidents, how his first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. "What does he want in return?" she had asked, though deep in her heart she already knew. "He wants a wife," her father said simply. "A young, respectable wife who can manage his household and give him children. He's heard about you through business connections. About your education, your skills with numbers and reading." Eleanor had stared at him in shock. "Papa, you can't be serious. You can't mean to sell me like livestock." "It's not selling," he protested weakly. "It's marriage. A proper marriage with a proper ceremony. You'll have fine clothes, a big house, servants to help you. You'll never want for anything. Except love," she had whispered. "Except choice. Except freedom." Her father's face had crumpled then, and she saw him for what he truly was. Not the strong man who had raised her after her mother's death, but a broken gambler who had bet away not just their future but hers as well. Now, walking toward the train depot with that cursed ticket to Sacramento in her coat pocket, Eleanor felt as if she were walking to her own execution. The town around her seemed different somehow, as if she were seeing it for the last time. Mrs. Peterson was hanging laundry behind the bakery, her usual cheerful self. Old Mr. Jameson sat on his porch whittling just as he did every morning. Children played in the dusty street, their laughter carrying on the warm air. These people had watched her grow up. They had seen her struggle through her lessons at the small schoolhouse, celebrated when she learned to read better than children twice her age. They had brought food when her mother was dying and had comforted her father in his grief. Now they looked away when she passed, unable to meet her eyes because they all knew where she was going and why. The worst part was thinking about Thomas, sweet, ambitious Thomas, who had courted her properly for 2 whole years before leaving town to seek his fortune. He had promised to return for her once he had enough money to provide a good home. That was 2 years ago, and she hadn't received a single letter. Her father insisted that Thomas had forgotten her, had probably found some city girl in Denver or San Francisco. But Eleanor's heart refused to believe it. She had waited for him. Through the long months when other young men had tried to court her, she had remained faithful to Thomas's memory. She had imagined their reunion 1,000 times, how he would ride into town with a pocket full of gold, how he would ask her father for her hand properly, how they would build a small house near the creek and fill it with children and laughter. Instead, she was walking to a train that would carry her away from everything she had ever known, to marry a man who was old enough to be her grandfather and cruel enough to make grown men afraid. The train depot came into view, its red brick walls and platform bustling with activity. The morning train from Denver was just pulling in, belching black smoke into the clear sky. Soon the afternoon train would arrive, her train, the one that would take her west to California and to Cornelius Whitmore. She thought about the stories she had heard about Whitmore's ranch. It was said to be like a small kingdom, with hundreds of workers and thousands of cattle. The main house was supposed to be grander than anything in Denver, with imported furniture and crystal chandeliers. But she had also heard about the isolation, how wives and daughters of neighboring ranchers were afraid to visit alone, how even business partners seemed nervous in Whitmore's presence. Eleanor's steps slowed as she approached the platform. A part of her wondered what would happen if she simply didn't get on the train. But where could she go? She had no money, no relatives who could take her in, and her father's debts would still remain. The men he owed money to were not the patient type. She had seen what happened to other families who couldn't pay their gambling debts. She found a bench near the platform and sat down heavily, setting her carpetbag beside her. Inside were her few remaining possessions: her mother's Bible, 2 plain dresses, some undergarments, and the small music box her mother had given her as a child. Everything else had been sold to pay down the debts. Other passengers were beginning to gather on the platform. A businessman in a fine suit checked his pocket watch impatiently. A woman with 3 small children tried to keep them from running toward the tracks. An elderly couple sat quietly together, holding hands and watching the world go by. Eleanor wondered if any of them had ever faced a choice like hers. Had the businessman ever been forced to give up his dreams for money? Had the mother ever had to choose between her children's safety and her own happiness? Had the elderly couple ever been separated by circumstances beyond their control? The tears came harder now, and she didn't try to stop them. Let the whole town see her crying. Let them remember this moment and think about what their silence had cost. She was 22 years old, educated, capable of so much more than being some rich man's trophy wife. But none of that mattered now. As she sat there weeping, Eleanor didn't notice the weathered cowboy who had stepped off the morning train, his eyes drawn to her obvious distress. She didn't see him hesitate, clearly debating whether to approach a stranger in her moment of grief. All she could think about was the sound of the train wheels that would soon carry her away from everything she had ever loved, toward a future that felt more like a prison sentence than a new beginning. Jake Morrison had seen a lot of heartbreak in his 32 years, but something about the young woman crying on the depot bench hit him differently. He stood near the platform with his own travel bag, having just stepped off the morning train from Denver, and found himself unable to look away from her obvious pain. He'd returned to Silver Creek after 2 long years on the cattle trails, his pockets finally heavy with the money he'd saved from driving herds north to the railroad towns. Every dollar had been earned through blistering sun, freezing rain, and nights spent watching for rustlers under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Now he was back in the town where he'd grown up, ready to buy his own piece of land and build the life he'd always dreamed of. But first, he needed to figure out why this young woman looked like her world was ending. Jake wasn't the type to intrude on strangers, especially ladies in distress. His mother had raised him to be respectful, to tip his hat and mind his own business unless specifically asked for help. But something about this situation felt different. The girl's sobs weren't just sadness. They sounded like desperation, like someone saying goodbye to everything they loved. He studied her more closely, trying to place her face. Silver Creek wasn't a big town, and he'd lived here until he was 25. Surely he would remember someone that pretty, even if she'd been just a child when he left. Her dark hair was pinned up neatly despite her tears, and her dress, though simple and worn, was clean and well mended. This wasn't some saloon girl or drifter. This was a respectable young woman from a good family. Then it struck him: the ribbon shop. He remembered a girl who used to help her father sell ribbons and buttons at the general store on Saturdays. She couldn't have been more than 18 when he left town, but she'd always been polite when he'd bought supplies, always had a genuine smile for the customers. Eleanor Matthews, that was it. But what could have happened to Eleanor Matthews to leave her crying like her heart was broken on a train platform at 9 in the morning? Jake glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed her distress. A few other passengers were milling about, but they seemed focused on their own travels. The station master was busy with paperwork in his office. It appeared that no one else was going to help, and Jake's conscience wouldn't let him just walk away. He approached slowly, removing his weathered hat as his mother had taught him to do when addressing a lady. His boots made soft sounds on the wooden platform, and he cleared his throat gently to announce his presence without startling her. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slight drawl he'd picked up during his years working with cowboys from Texas and Oklahoma. "I don't mean to intrude on your personal business, but it pains me to see someone so troubled." Eleanor looked up through her tears, and Jake saw that he'd been right about her identity. She was older now, of course, but those same kind eyes and gentle features were unmistakable. What struck him most was how lost she looked, like a child who had gotten separated from her parents in a crowd. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the response that all well-brought-up young ladies were taught to give. But her voice shook and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks even as she tried to wipe them away with a small handkerchief. Jake crouched down slightly so he wasn't towering over her, making his presence less intimidating. "Miss Eleanor, isn't it? Eleanor Matthews? You probably don't remember me. Jake Morrison. I used to buy supplies from your father's ribbon counter before I left town a few years back." Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by embarrassment. "Mr. Morrison," she said, trying to compose herself. Yes, I remember you. You always bought the brown thread for mending." The small detail surprised him. He had indeed always bought brown thread, finding it the most practical color for repairing his work clothes. That she remembered such a tiny thing spoke to the kind of person she was, someone who paid attention, who cared about the people around her. "That's right," he said with a gentle smile. "Now I don't want to pry into matters that aren't my concern, but I've spent enough time around troubled folks to know the difference between regular sadness and the kind of pain that comes from being trapped with no way out." Eleanor's composure crumbled again at his words. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered. "Nobody can help with this kind of trouble." Jake settled his hat in his lap and sat down on the bench beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Try me," he said simply. "I've seen a lot of the world these past 2 years, met all kinds of people facing all kinds of problems. Sometimes talking to a stranger can help more than you'd think." For a long moment, Eleanor just stared at her hands folded in her lap. Jake waited patiently, watching the town come to life around them. Mrs. Henderson was opening the general store, hanging out her sign and sweeping the front steps. Dr. Williams's buggy rolled past, probably heading to check on Mrs. Carlton's new baby. It was all so normal, so peaceful, which made Eleanor's distress stand out even more sharply. Finally, she spoke. "Are you married, Mr. Morrison?" The question surprised him. "No, miss. Never found the right woman, and my work didn't leave much time for courting." "Do you believe people should be able to choose who they marry?" Now Jake understood this was about more than general sadness. "I do," he said firmly. "I believe marriage should be between two people who care for each other and choose to build a life together." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. How wonderful that must be to have such choices. Jake's jaw tightened as the pieces began falling into place. Someone's trying to force you into a marriage you don't want. It wasn't a question, and Eleanor didn't try to deny it. Instead, she told him everything. About her father's gambling debts, about Cornelius Whitmore's offer, about the train ticket in her pocket and the life of luxury that awaited her in California, a life that felt more like a prison sentence. As she spoke, Jake's hands clenched into fists. He'd heard of Cornelius Whitmore, had even seen him once at a cattle auction in Denver. The man had a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of who got hurt in the process. The idea of this sweet, gentle girl being handed over to someone like that made Jake's blood boil. "There has to be another way," he said when she finished her story. Eleanor shook her head. $3,000, Mr. Morrison. That's more money than my father could earn in 10 years, even if he worked every single day. And the people he owes? They're not the patient type." Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking. $3,000 was indeed a fortune, but it wasn't impossible. He had nearly $2,000 saved from his cattle work, and he'd been planning to buy land anyway. Maybe there was a way to help that would benefit them both. "Miss Eleanor," he said carefully, "what if I told you that you still have a choice, that getting on that train isn't your only option?" She looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Jake said, his mind racing as he formed a plan, "that sometimes the answer to one person's problem can solve another person's problem too. I came back to Silver Creek with money to invest and a need for a business partner. You need a way to pay your father's debts and stay in control of your own life. Eleanor stared at him as if he'd just suggested they could fly to the moon. Mr. Morrison, I don't understand what you're suggesting. Jake took a deep breath. What he was about to propose was unconventional, possibly scandalous, and definitely risky. But looking at Eleanor's tear-stained face and knowing what awaited her in California, he knew he had to try. I'm suggesting a partnership, he said, a business arrangement that could save you from Cornelius Whitmore and help me build the ranch I've been dreaming of. It would be completely respectable, completely proper, and completely your choice. The afternoon train whistle sounded in the distance, still miles away, but getting closer. Eleanor's train. Her ticket to a life she didn't want with a man she feared. You still have a choice, Jake whispered, leaning closer so only she could hear. Whatever's driving you to that train, it doesn't have to be your only path. Will you let me tell you about another way? Eleanor's first instinct was to stand up and walk away. This stranger, this cowboy she barely remembered, was offering her some kind of business arrangement when what she needed was a miracle. $3,000 didn't just appear because someone was kind enough to want to help. There had to be a catch, some condition that would make her situation even worse than it already was. Mr. Morrison, she said, rising from the bench and picking up her carpet bag. I appreciate your concern, truly I do. But you don't understand the situation. This isn't something that can be fixed with good intentions. But Jake stood too, his expression earnest and determined. Please just give me 5 minutes to explain. What harm could 5 minutes do? Eleanor glanced toward the train tracks where the afternoon train would arrive in less than an hour. 5 minutes wouldn't change anything, but something in Jake's voice made her pause. Maybe it was the way he'd said you still have a choice, as if he truly believed it. Maybe it was simply that no one had offered her any alternative, no matter how impossible it might be. 5 minutes, she agreed, settling back onto the bench. Jake sat beside her again, and she noticed how he kept his distance, how he held his hat respectfully in his hands. Whatever he was about to propose, his manner suggested it wouldn't be anything improper. First, he said, I want you to know that I remember more about you than just the brown thread. I remember how you always made sure the younger children got the prettiest ribbons for their hair, even when their families couldn't afford the best ones. I remember how you'd slip extra buttons into packages when you thought no one was looking. You have a good heart, Miss Eleanor, and that's not something that should be wasted on a man like Cornelius Whitmore. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed those small kindnesses. That's very kind of you to say. It's not kindness, it's truth, Jake said firmly. Now about your father's debts. $3,000 is a lot of money, but it's not impossible money. I've been working cattle drives for 2 years, living rough and saving every penny I could. I've got nearly $2,000 in my saddlebags right now, and I know where I can get the rest. Eleanor's eyes widened. She'd never known anyone who carried that much money, let alone spoke about it so casually. But why would you even consider helping me? You barely know me. Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains that surrounded their little town. Do you remember Thomas Hartley? He left town around the same time I did, looking for work in the mining camps. The mention of Thomas's name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Thomas, you know Thomas? He joined our cattle outfit about 6 months ago, Jake said gently. Been working with us ever since, saving money just like I was. And Miss Eleanor, that man has talked about you every single day for the past 6 months. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth and fresh tears sprang to her eyes. He's alive? He's really alive? More than alive. He's been working himself near to death trying to earn enough money to come back for you. He was planning to return to Silver Creek next month with a proposal and enough money to buy a little house near the creek. But I haven't heard from him in 2 years, Eleanor whispered. I thought he'd forgotten me or found someone else or... Jake's expression grew grim. He wrote you letters, Miss Eleanor. Dozens of them. Gave them to other cowboys heading through Silver Creek, paid them to make sure the letters got delivered. When he never heard back, he figured you'd moved on. It wasn't until last week that we met a drifter who told us the mail service through Silver Creek has been spotty at best. Letters getting lost, delayed, sometimes never delivered at all. Eleanor felt as if the world was spinning around her. Thomas was alive. Thomas still loved her. Thomas had been writing to her all this time, and she'd never received a single letter. The cruelty of it was almost too much to bear. Where is he now? She asked desperately. Still in Kansas, finishing up the last drive of the season. He's planning to head home in 2 weeks. Jake paused, studying her face carefully. Miss Eleanor, if Thomas knew what was happening to you right now, if he knew you were being forced to marry Cornelius Whitmore, he would ride straight through to get here. He'd probably kill himself trying to reach you in time. Then why don't you send him a telegram? Eleanor asked. Tell him to come now? Jake shook his head. Because even if he left today, he couldn't get here before your train leaves. And because what I'm about to propose might be better for everyone involved. Eleanor wiped her eyes with her handkerchief, trying to think clearly despite the emotional chaos in her head. What kind of proposal? A business partnership, Jake said. I buy out your father's debts, all of them. In exchange, you help me establish a ranch and general store here in Silver Creek. We'd be business partners, nothing more. Separate living quarters, completely respectable arrangement. You'd have your freedom, your choice, and when Thomas returns, you could marry him with no debts hanging over your family's head. It sounded too good to be true, which made Eleanor suspicious. What would you get out of such an arrangement? Surely you don't need me to run a ranch or a store. Jake smiled, and Eleanor noticed how it changed his whole face, making him look younger and less weathered. Miss Eleanor, I can rope a steer and brand a calf and drive cattle across 3 states without losing a single head. But I can barely add 2 numbers together without making mistakes. And my handwriting looks like chicken scratches. I need someone smart to handle the business side of things. Someone I can trust with money and accounts and dealing with customers. You could hire anyone for that, Eleanor pointed out. I could hire a stranger, Jake agreed. But I'd rather help someone who needs helping. Someone I know has good character. And there's something else. He paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. I've been thinking about settling down, maybe finding a wife eventually. But I want to do it right, take my time, find someone who wants to marry me for the right reasons. Having a business partner would take away the pressure, let me get to know the ladies in town without everyone expecting immediate proposals. Eleanor found herself almost smiling despite everything. So I would be your protection from matchmaking mothers. Something like that, Jake said with a grin. And you'd have protection from men like Cornelius Whitmore. A business partnership with a respectable rancher would give you standing in the community, financial security, and most importantly, the freedom to make your own choices about marriage when you're ready. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. Eleanor could see the smoke in the distance, black against the blue sky. In 30 minutes, that train would be at the platform, and she would have to make a choice that would determine the rest of her life. Mr. Morrison, she said slowly, assuming you're serious about this proposal, and assuming it's even possible, what would happen when Thomas returns? He's not going to understand why I'm living on a ranch with another man, business partnership or not. Jake nodded, clearly having thought about this already. Thomas is a good man, Miss Eleanor. When he hears the whole story, when he understands what you were facing and how the partnership saved you from Whitmore, he'll be grateful. And when you two are ready to marry, we'll dissolve the business arrangement. I'll sell out my share to Thomas if he wants it, or help you both start fresh somewhere else. Eleanor stared at him in amazement. You would do all that for people you barely know? I'd do it for people I care about, Jake said simply. And whether you remember me or not, I've cared about the people of this town since I was a boy. Silver Creek has been good to me, and it's time I was good to Silver Creek. The sound of the approaching train was getting louder. Soon the conductor would be calling for passengers, and Eleanor would have to board or miss her last chance to save her father from his creditors. But now, for the first time in 3 days, she had another option, a choice that didn't involve sacrificing her future to pay for her father's mistakes, a partnership that could give her the independence she'd always dreamed of while keeping her close to the people and places she loved. It was risky, unconventional, and would certainly cause talk in their small town. But as Eleanor looked into Jake Morrison's honest face and thought about the alternative waiting for her in California, she realized that sometimes the biggest risk was not taking a chance at all. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning, I think we need to have a longer conversation about this partnership of yours. The train whistle grew louder, and Eleanor could feel time slipping away like sand through her fingers. But for the first time in days, she wasn't thinking about Cornelius Whitmore or the dreaded journey to California. Instead, she found herself studying Jake Morrison's weathered face, trying to determine if his incredible offer could possibly be genuine. "Tell me exactly how this would work," she said, setting her carpetbag firmly on the ground beside the bench. The action felt symbolic somehow. She wasn't picking it up to board the train just yet. Jake pulled out a leather pouch from his coat and loosened the drawstring. Eleanor's eyes widened as she saw the roll of bills inside. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. "I've got $1,800 here," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so other passengers wouldn't overhear. "Been living on beans and hardtack for 2 years to save it. I can get the other $1,200 from the bank in Denver. They know me from cattle sales and they'll loan against the herd I'm planning to buy." "But that would put you in debt," Eleanor protested. "You'd be trading your freedom for mine." Jake shook his head. "It's different when it's your choice to take on debt for something you want. I came back here planning to spend most of this money anyway, buying land and stock and equipment. This way, I get a business partner and the satisfaction of helping someone who deserves better than what fate handed her." Eleanor looked around the train platform, at the normal people going about their normal lives, and wondered if any of them had ever faced a decision like this. What would people say? An unmarried woman living on a ranch with an unmarried man, even as business partners? "We do it properly," Jake assured her. "I've been looking at the old Patterson place about 3 miles north of town. Big house with 2 separate wings, barn in good condition, plenty of grazing land. We could fix up 1 wing for you. 1 for me, with the kitchen and common areas in between for business, meetings. Mrs. Patterson could stay on as housekeeper. If she wanted, she's been taking care of the place since her husband died anyway." The idea was starting to sound less impossible and more like an actual plan. Eleanor had always been good with numbers and organization. During the years when her father's ribbon business was thriving, she'd kept all his books, managed his inventory, even helped him negotiate better prices with suppliers. The work had felt natural to her, satisfying in a way that purely domestic tasks never had. "What kind of business were you thinking of?" she asked. Jake's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Cattle primarily. I know the business, know how to buy good stock and when to sell for the best prices. But I also want to open a proper general store. Something bigger and better stocked than what Silver Creek has now. People shouldn't have to travel all the way to Denver for basic supplies." "That would require a lot of capital," Eleanor said, her practical mind already calculating costs. "And you'd need reliable suppliers, good relationships with freight companies." "See?" Jake said with a grin. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I need. I can handle the ranching side, but I'd be lost trying to manage suppliers and freight schedules and customer accounts." Eleanor found herself getting caught up in his vision despite her circumstances. "You'd want to carry more than just basic supplies. Fabric and sewing notions, books and writing materials, maybe even some luxury items for special occasions. And if you set up the store right, you could also buy produce from local farmers and sell it to people in town who don't have gardens." "Now you're thinking like a business owner," Jake said approvingly. "This could work, Miss Eleanor. We could build something good here, something that helps the whole community." But even as excitement built in her chest, reality crashed back down. "Mr. Morrison, this all sounds wonderful, but what if my father won't agree? What if he insists I honor the arrangement with Mr. Whitmore?" Jake's expression grew serious. "Then we'll have to convince him that this is a better solution. For you and for him. He owes money to dangerous people," Eleanor said quietly. "Men who don't care about business partnerships or proper arrangements. They want their money and they want it soon." "How soon?" Eleanor's stomach clenched as she remembered the conversation she'd overheard between her father and one of his creditors. "End of this week. If he doesn't have their money by Friday, they said they'd start taking other forms of payment." Jake's jaw tightened. "What kind of other payment?" "They didn't say exactly, but..." Eleanor shuddered. "I think they were talking about the house, maybe forcing him to work for them until the debt is paid. Papa's getting older, Mr. Morrison. He couldn't handle that kind of work, and I don't think they'd care." The train was pulling into the station now, its brakes squealing against the wheels as it slowed. Passengers began gathering their belongings and moving toward the platform edge. Eleanor watched them with a strange detachment, as if she were observing a scene from someone else's life. "Miss Eleanor," Jake said urgently, "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She looked at him, really looked at him. His face was honest and open, marked by years of hard work under the sun but not hardened by cruelty or selfishness. His eyes held genuine concern for her welfare, not the calculating look she'd seen in Cornelius Whitmore's gaze during his visit to her father. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "if I agree to this partnership, what happens right now, today?" "Right now you don't get on that train," Jake said firmly. "We go to your father's house and I pay his debts. All of them, today. Then we start planning our future. And if it doesn't work, if the partnership fails or people won't accept the arrangement or—" Jake reached over and gently touched her hand, the first physical contact between them. His fingers were calloused but warm, steadying. "Then we'll figure out another solution. But Miss Eleanor, I promise you this. You will never be forced to marry anyone you don't choose. Not while I have breath in my body." The conductor stepped off the train and began calling for passengers. "All aboard for points west. Denver, Salt Lake City, Sacramento." Eleanor's heart pounded as she realized this was the moment. In the next few seconds, she would either board that train and submit to a life she didn't want, or trust this unexpected stranger with her future. She thought about Thomas, somewhere in Kansas, believing she'd forgotten him. She thought about her father, trapped by his own poor choices, but still the man who had raised her with love and kindness. She thought about Cornelius Whitmore, waiting in his grand house in California like a spider in its web. Then, she thought about the alternative Jake was offering. Partnership, independence, choice. The chance to build something meaningful with her own hands and mind. The possibility that when Thomas returned, she could meet him as an equal, not as someone who needed rescuing. "Mr. Morrison," she said, standing up and leaving her carpet bag where it sat. "I believe we have some debts to pay." Jake's face broke into a wide smile as he stood beside her. "Yes, ma'am, we certainly do." As they walked away from the train platform together, Eleanor heard the conductor make his final call for passengers. She didn't look back. For the first time in days, she was walking toward something instead of away from it, and for the first time in years, she was making a choice that was entirely her own. Behind them, the train pulled away from Silver Creek, carrying other passengers toward their destinations in the west. It would reach Sacramento without Eleanor Matthews aboard, and when Cornelius Whitmore came to the station to collect his promised bride, he would find only empty tracks and the beginning of a story he hadn't planned for. Eleanor's future was still uncertain, still full of risks and unknowns, but now it was hers to shape, and she was going to meet it with her head held high and her heart full of hope. Eleanor and Jake walked through the dusty streets of Silver Creek with a sense of purpose that Eleanor hadn't felt in months. For the first time since learning about her father's debts, she felt like she was taking control of her own destiny rather than being swept along by circumstances beyond her control. But as they approached the small house where she'd grown up, Eleanor's steps began to slow. The closer they got to home, the more real her situation became. In just a few minutes, she would have to face her father and tell him she wasn't getting on that train. She would have to explain about Jake's offer and hope that her father would accept help from a virtual stranger instead of the guaranteed money from Cornelius Whitmore. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jake asked gently, noticing her hesitation. "Not about refusing to marry Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said firmly, "but I'm worried about Papa's reaction. He's been so ashamed of the debts, so desperate for a solution. What if he won't listen?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "Miss Eleanor, your father may have made some poor choices, but he loves you. When he understands that there's another way to solve this problem, a way that doesn't require you to sacrifice your happiness, he'll listen." Eleanor hoped Jake was right, but she knew her father's pride might make things complicated. He'd been so relieved when Cornelius Whitmore offered to pay the debts in exchange for marriage. The arrangement had felt like salvation to him, even if it felt like damnation to her. As they reached the front gate of the small house, Eleanor noticed something that made her heart sink. A fancy black carriage was parked outside, its polished sides gleaming in the afternoon sun. Two well-dressed horses stood patiently in their traces, and a driver sat on the box looking bored but alert. "Oh no," Eleanor whispered, her face going pale. "He's here. Who's here?" Jake asked, though something in Eleanor's tone made him tense up. "Cornelius Whitmore. That's his carriage." Eleanor's hands began to shake. "He wasn't supposed to come for me. I was supposed to take the train to him." Through the front window of the house, they could see shadows moving around inside. Eleanor caught glimpses of her father's familiar figure, but there were others as well. Larger, more imposing silhouettes that could only belong to Whitmore and whoever had traveled with him. "Maybe we should wait," Eleanor said, taking a step backward. "Come back when he's gone." But Jake shook his head firmly. "No, Miss Eleanor. Running away won't solve anything. Besides, it might be better this way. Better to face him directly and make it clear that you've made other arrangements." Eleanor knew Jake was right, but that didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. Cornelius Whitmore was used to getting what he wanted, and he wouldn't be pleased to discover that his intended bride had changed her mind. She'd heard stories about his temper, about business partners who had crossed him and lived to regret it. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor straightened her shoulders and walked up the front path with Jake beside her. Before they could knock, the front door swung open, and Eleanor found herself face to face with her father. Henry Matthews looked older than his 55 years, his hair grayer and his face more lined than Eleanor remembered. The stress of the past few months had taken a visible toll on him. Behind him stood a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit, Cornelius Whitmore himself. Eleanor's first thought was that Whitmore looked exactly like what she'd expected. Wealthy, powerful, and completely sure of himself. He was probably 60 years old, with silver hair and cold gray eyes that seemed to take in everything and judge it according to his own standards. When his gaze fell on Eleanor, she felt like livestock being evaluated at an auction. "Eleanor," her father exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. "Thank goodness you're here. Mr. Whitmore arrived this morning with wonderful news. He's decided to have the wedding ceremony here in Silver Creek before taking you back to California." "Isn't that thoughtful?" Eleanor felt Jake tense beside her, and she knew this was the moment of truth. "Papa," she said carefully, "I need to speak with you privately." But Whitmore stepped forward before her father could respond. "Miss Matthews," he said in a deep, commanding voice, "there's no need for privacy between family members. Your father has told me all about your nervousness regarding our upcoming marriage. It's perfectly natural for a young woman to have concerns about leaving her childhood home." "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor began, but he held up a hand to silence her. "Please, call me Cornelius. After all, we'll be married tomorrow morning." He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I've brought my own minister to perform the ceremony, and I've arranged for a lovely reception at the hotel. Everything is taken care of." Eleanor's heart pounded as she realized how much more complicated this situation had become. Whitmore wasn't just expecting her to honor the arrangement. He'd moved up the timeline and was planning to marry her immediately. "Sir," Jake said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Whitmore's cold gaze shifted to Jake, taking in his simple clothes and weathered appearance with obvious disdain. "And you are?" "Jake Morrison," Jake replied calmly. "Miss Eleanor's business partner." The words fell into the small front room like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and shock. Eleanor's father stared at Jake as if he'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, while Whitmore's expression darkened considerably. "Business partner?" Henry Matthews stammered. "Eleanor, what is this man talking about?" Eleanor knew there was no going back now. Taking a deep breath, she stepped closer to her father. "Papa, I didn't get on the train today. Mr. Morrison has offered me an alternative arrangement, a business partnership that would allow him to pay your debts while giving me the independence to make my own choices about marriage." "That's impossible," Whitmore said flatly. "Miss Matthews has already promised to me. We have a signed agreement." "An agreement made without Eleanor's consent," Jake pointed out, his voice remaining steady despite the tension in the room. "And since no legal marriage has taken place, she's free to make other arrangements." Whitmore's face flushed with anger, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the temper she'd heard so much about. "Young man, you have no idea who you're dealing with. I am Cornelius Whitmore, and when I make an agreement, it gets honored. Not if it involves forcing someone into marriage against their will," Jake replied, and Eleanor noticed that his hand had moved slightly toward his side, where she could see the handle of a gun beneath his coat. "Papa," Eleanor said urgently, turning to her father, "please listen to me. I don't want to marry Mr. Whitmore. I never wanted to marry him. This partnership with Mr. Morrison would solve your debt problem without requiring me to give up my freedom." Henry Matthews looked torn between hope and fear. "Eleanor, darling, Mr. Whitmore has been so generous. He's already paid some of the debts and he's promised to take care of everything. What debts has he paid? Jake asked sharply. Whitmore smiled coldly. The gambling debts, of course. The most pressing ones, the ones that carried the most immediate consequences for failure to pay. Eleanor's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Whitmore had deliberately paid the debts that posed the greatest physical threat to her father, making himself seem like a savior, while also making it much harder for them to refuse his offer. How much? Jake asked directly. $1,500, Whitmore replied smugly. Money that would need to be repaid immediately if Miss Matthews were to suddenly change her mind about our arrangement. Jake was quiet for a moment, calculating. Eleanor knew he didn't have $1,500 plus the remaining debts. His generous offer had just become impossible. But then Jake reached into his coat and pulled out his leather money pouch. $1,500, plus the remaining $1,500 owed to other creditors, he said calmly. $3,000 total, just as we discussed. Whitmore's eyes widened slightly as Jake began counting out bills. You can't possibly have that much money. I've been working cattle drives for 2 years, Jake replied, living rough and saving every penny. And unlike you, Mr. Whitmore, I don't believe in forcing people into arrangements they don't want. The tension in the room was reaching a breaking point. Eleanor could see that Whitmore was furious at being challenged, especially by someone he clearly considered beneath his social station. Her father looked confused and overwhelmed by the rapid developments. Just then they heard the sound of boots on the front porch. The door opened and Sheriff Williams stepped inside, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Afternoon, folks, the sheriff said mildly. Got reports of raised voices over here. Everything all right? Eleanor realized that someone, probably a neighbor, had heard the confrontation and decided to call for help. In a small town like Silver Creek, disputes involving wealthy outsiders tended to attract attention quickly. Sheriff Williams, Eleanor said quickly, could you please help us clarify something about marriage agreements? If a woman is promised in marriage but no legal ceremony has taken place, can she change her mind? The sheriff looked around the room, taking in the obvious tension between the parties. Well, Miss Eleanor, unless there's been a legal marriage ceremony, a woman of legal age is free to make her own choices about who she marries. That's the law. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Cornelius Whitmore, and Eleanor was still adjusting to her new life at the Patterson Ranch. The arrangement Jake had proposed was working better than either of them had dared to hope, though it hadn't been without its challenges. The first week had been the hardest. Moving into the east wing of the large farmhouse had felt strange and exciting at the same time. Mrs. Patterson, a kindly widow in her 60s, had been delighted to stay on as housekeeper and had helped Eleanor settle into her new quarters. The rooms were simple but comfortable, with large windows that looked out over the rolling hills and a small sitting area where Eleanor could work on the business accounts. Jake had been as good as his word about maintaining propriety. He lived in the west wing of the house, and they met only in the common areas for meals and business discussions. He was unfailingly polite and respectful, never presuming on their arrangement or making her feel uncomfortable about their unconventional partnership. But Eleanor had quickly discovered that running a ranch and general store was far more complicated than she'd imagined. The morning after moving in, Jake had handed her a ledger book and a box of receipts that looked like they'd been organized by a whirlwind. I tried to keep track of everything, he'd said apologetically, but numbers have never been my strong suit. I can tell you exactly how many head of cattle I bought and what I paid for them, but when it comes to writing it all down in an orderly fashion, Eleanor had spent the better part of 2 days just sorting through the paperwork, creating a proper bookkeeping system that would let them track their expenses and profits. It was work she enjoyed, the kind of detailed, organized thinking that had always come naturally to her. But it had also shown her just how much money Jake had invested in their partnership. He'd bought 30 head of prime cattle from a rancher in Denver, along with 2 horses, supplies for the ranch, and materials to renovate the old Patterson general store in town. The total expenditure was staggering, nearly $4,000 when everything was added up. Eleanor realized that Jake had invested not just his savings, but had taken on debt to make their partnership work. You didn't tell me you'd borrowed money, she'd said one evening as they reviewed the accounts together in the main sitting room. Jake had looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression sheepish. Didn't want to worry you. Besides, it's good debt. the kind that helps build something valuable. But what if our business fails? What if we can't make enough profit to pay back the loans? Jake had set down his work and looked at her directly. Miss Eleanor, I didn't go into this partnership planning to fail. With your head for business and my experience with cattle and ranching, we're going to succeed. But even if something did go wrong, that would be my problem, not yours. I made the choice to invest in this venture. Eleanor had been touched by his confidence in their partnership, but also troubled by the responsibility she felt for his financial risk. She'd thrown herself into the work with even greater determination, spending long hours planning inventory for the store and developing relationships with suppliers in Denver. The general store renovation had been a major project. The old Patterson store had been closed for 2 years since Mr. Patterson's death, and it needed extensive repairs and updating. Jake proved to be surprisingly handy with carpentry and painting, working alongside Eleanor to transform the dusty, neglected building into a bright, welcoming space. Eleanor had discovered that she loved the planning aspects of retail business. She'd studied what other successful stores offered, talked to potential customers about what they needed, and developed an inventory plan that would serve the community better than the limited selection previously available in Silver Creek. We should carry more variety in fabric, she'd told Jake one afternoon as they painted the interior walls. The ladies in town have to travel all the way to Denver for anything beyond basic cotton. If we stock wool, silk, and some prettier prints, they'd buy from us instead. Whatever you think is best, Jake had replied. You understand that side of the business better than I do. Eleanor had also suggested adding a small lending library to the store, where people could borrow books for a small fee. Most folks can't afford to buy books, but they'd pay a penny or two to borrow them. And it would bring people into the store regularly, which means they're more likely to buy other things while they're here. Jake had been impressed by her business sense, and Eleanor had found herself gaining confidence in her abilities. For the first time in her life, she was using her education and natural intelligence for something more meaningful than keeping house or making conversation at church socials. But it wasn't all work. Eleanor and Jake had also begun to know each other as people, not just business partners. She'd discovered that Jake was well-read despite his claims of poor education, and that he had a dry sense of humor that often caught her off guard. You know, he'd said one evening as they sat on the front porch after a long day of work, when I imagined having a business partner, I thought it would be someone who'd argue with me more. About what? Eleanor had asked, genuinely curious. Everything. Most business partnerships I've seen involve a lot of disagreement about money and decisions and who's responsible for what. But you just figure out what needs doing and do it. Eleanor had smiled at that. Maybe that's because we both want the same thing, for this venture to succeed. It's easier to work together when you're working toward the same goals. Their relationship had settled into a comfortable routine of mutual respect and cooperation. Jake handled the physical aspects of ranching, caring for the cattle, maintaining equipment, and dealing with other ranchers. Eleanor managed the financial side and prepared for the store opening. Mrs. Patterson kept house for both of them and served as an informal chaperone, which helped quiet any gossip about the propriety of their arrangement. But Eleanor knew that people in town were still talking. She'd noticed the looks and whispered conversations when she went into Silver Creek for supplies. Most folks seemed willing to accept the partnership as legitimate business arrangement, especially since Mrs. Patterson vouched for the respectability of the setup. But there were some who clearly thought the whole thing was scandalous. Let them talk, Jake had said when Eleanor mentioned her concerns. Actions speak louder than gossip. When our business is successful and we're contributing to the community, people will judge us by what we do, not what they imagined we might be doing. Eleanor had been grateful for his practical attitude, but she still felt the weight of being watched and judged. She'd been raised to care about her reputation, and the unconventional nature of their partnership sometimes made her anxious about what people thought. The worst moment had come during her second week at the ranch. She'd been in town ordering supplies when she'd overheard 2 women talking outside the church. Living out there with an unmarried man, no matter what they call it. One had said disapprovingly, that poor girl has no idea how this will affect her chances of making a proper marriage someday. Well, what choice did she have? The other had replied, better than being forced to marry that awful Whitmore fellow. At least Jake Morrison is a decent man. Decent or not, people will remember this arrangement. She's ruined her reputation for the sake of avoiding one unwanted marriage. Eleanor had hurried away before hearing more, but the words had stung. Was she ruining her future by choosing independence over convention? Would Thomas, when he returned, be ashamed of the choices she'd made? That evening, she'd been unusually quiet during dinner. Jake had noticed her mood and asked if something was troubling her. "Do you think I've made a mistake?" Eleanor had asked. "Choosing this partnership instead of more conventional options?" Jake had considered the question seriously before answering. "Miss Eleanor, I think you chose freedom over safety, independence over convention. Some people won't understand that choice, but that doesn't make it wrong. But what if it affects my future? What if Thomas returns and finds that I've damaged my reputation by living here? Then Thomas would be a fool," Jake had said firmly. "Any man worthy of you would understand that you chose the best option available to you in a difficult situation. And any man who would judge you for choosing independence over submission to someone like Cornelius Whitmore isn't a man you'd want to marry anyway." Eleanor had found his words comforting, but she still wondered sometimes if she'd been too quick to abandon conventional expectations. The truth was, she was enjoying her new life more than she'd expected. She felt useful, respected, and intellectually challenged in ways she'd never experienced before. But that enjoyment itself sometimes made her feel guilty, as if she should be more eager to return to traditional domestic life. As autumn approached and their store opening drew near, Eleanor realized that her partnership with Jake had given her something she'd never had before: the chance to discover what she was truly capable of when given the opportunity. Whatever happened with Thomas, whatever the future held, she would always be grateful for this period of growth and self-discovery. But late at night, lying in her comfortable bed in the east wing of the house, Eleanor still wondered what would happen when Thomas finally returned to Silver Creek. October brought the first real test of Eleanor and Jake's partnership, and it came from a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. Cornelius Whitmore might have left Silver Creek in defeat, but he hadn't forgotten the public humiliation he'd suffered. His revenge, when it came, was subtle and calculated. It started with whispers. Eleanor first noticed something was wrong when Mrs. Henderson, at the original general store, began treating her coldly, during what should have been routine business discussions about transferring some of her customers to their new establishment. Instead of the warm cooperation Eleanor had expected, Mrs. Henderson was distant and professional. "I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to recommend your store to my customers," Mrs. Henderson had said stiffly. "Given the unusual circumstances of your business arrangement," Eleanor had been puzzled by the sudden change in attitude. Mrs. Henderson had been one of the first people to congratulate her on escaping the unwanted marriage to Whitmore, but now she acted as if Eleanor had done something shameful. The pattern repeated itself throughout the week. Mr. Jameson, who had initially offered to help with carpentry work on the store, sent word that he was too busy with other projects. The bank manager in the neighboring town of Pine Ridge, who had verbally agreed to extend credit for inventory purchases, suddenly decided that their partnership was too risky for a business loan. "Something's not right," Eleanor told Jake one evening as they sat in the main room, reviewing the day's disappointing interactions with potential suppliers and customers. "People who were friendly and supportive just 2 weeks ago are treating us like we have some kind of contagious disease." Jake had been noticing the same thing. "I went to see about buying feed grain from the Mitchell farm today. Old Tom Mitchell has sold me grain before, always been fair and friendly. Today he could barely look me in the eye, said he'd already sold his surplus to someone else." Eleanor set down her pen and looked at Jake seriously. "What if someone has been spreading stories about us? What if people believe that our partnership isn't as proper as we've claimed?" "Even if someone is spreading gossip," Jake said, "why would people suddenly believe it when they've known both of us for years? Mrs. Henderson watched you grow up. Mr. Jameson has known me since I was a boy. They know our character." But over the next few days, the truth began to emerge. Eleanor discovered what was happening when she overheard a conversation between two women outside the church after Sunday service. "Mr. Whitmore was so kind to stop and warn us," one woman was saying. "He said he felt responsible since he'd tried to save that poor Eleanor girl from making such a terrible mistake." "What exactly did he tell you?" the other woman asked. "That Jake Morrison has a terrible reputation in other towns, that he's known for taking advantage of young women in difficult situations, promising them business partnerships, and then, well, you can imagine. He said Eleanor has no idea what kind of man she's gotten involved with. Eleanor felt her blood run cold. Whitmore wasn't just spreading general gossip about impropriety. He was telling specific lies about Jake's character, painting him as some kind of predator who seduced vulnerable women. That evening, Eleanor confronted Jake with what she'd overheard. His face grew dark with anger as she repeated the conversation. "That's a complete lie," he said firmly. "I've never been involved in any kind of scandal with women, business partnership or otherwise. I can give you the names of a dozen ranchers who'll vouch for my character." "I know it's a lie," Eleanor assured him. "But the problem is that other people don't know you like I do. And Whitmore is wealthy and respected. When he warns people about your supposed reputation, they believe him." The situation got worse over the following week. 3 suppliers canceled orders they'd already confirmed. The minister's wife, who had initially offered to help organize a grand opening celebration for the store, sent word that she'd decided it wouldn't be appropriate for the church to be associated with their business. Most painfully for Eleanor, several women who had been her friends since childhood began avoiding her entirely. When she tried to speak to them after church, they made excuses and hurried away. She felt increasingly isolated, as if Whitmore's poisonous lies were building an invisible wall between her and the community she'd grown up in. "Maybe I should leave," Eleanor said one evening, her voice heavy with discouragement. "Maybe I should go away somewhere, let you rebuild your reputation without the burden of this partnership." Jake looked at her as if she'd suggested burning down the house. "Miss Eleanor, you're not a burden, and I'm not giving up on our partnership because some bitter old man is spreading lies. We'll find a way through this." But even Jake's optimism was tested when they experienced their first real financial setback. A cattle buyer from Denver, who had agreed to purchase 10 head of their stock, suddenly backed out of the deal after receiving what he called concerning information about Jake's business practices. Eleanor realized that Whitmore's campaign of whispered warnings was more than just social embarrassment. It was threatening their economic survival. Without customers for the store and buyers for their cattle, their business model would collapse. The crisis came to a head during what should have been a routine supply trip to Pine Ridge. Eleanor and Jake had loaded their wagon with goods to trade and were planning to finalize arrangements with several suppliers. Instead, they found that word of Whitmore's accusations had reached the larger town, and no one wanted to do business with them. "I'm sorry, miss," the warehouse manager at the largest supply company had said, his expression genuinely regretful. "Normally I'd be happy to work with you folks, but I can't risk my reputation by doing business with someone who might not be legitimate." Frustrated and discouraged, Eleanor and Jake had decided to camp outside town rather than pay for a hotel room they could no longer afford. They'd made a small fire and were sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese when they heard horsemen approaching through the darkness. "That's odd," Jake said quietly, reaching for the rifle he always carried on trips. "Most folks don't travel these roads after dark." 4 men emerged from the shadows, and Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the leader, Calvin Wright, one of Cornelius Whitmore's ranch foremen. She'd seen him during Whitmore's visit to her father's house, a hard-faced man with cruel eyes who clearly enjoyed intimidating people. Well, Wright said with a nasty smile. "If it isn't the famous business partners. Mr. Whitmore thought you might come through Pine Ridge eventually." Jake stood slowly, keeping his rifle ready, but not pointing it directly at the men. "Mr. Wright, isn't it? What can we do for you?" "You can listen to some friendly advice," Wright replied, though his tone was anything but friendly. "Mr. Whitmore is a generous man, forgiving man. He's willing to forget about the embarrassment that you caused him in Silver Creek. All you have to do is dissolve this fake partnership and let the girl come to California where she belongs. That's not going to happen," Jake said calmly. Wright's smile widened unpleasantly. "Maybe you didn't understand me, Cowboy. This wasn't really a request." Eleanor's hands trembled as she realized they were in serious danger. These men hadn't ridden all this way just to have a conversation. They'd come to force her compliance through threats and intimidation. "Mr. Wright," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I'm a free woman who made a legal choice about my own future. Mr. Whitmore has no claim on me. Mr. Whitmore paid good money for you, girl. Money he hasn't gotten back, despite what your cowboy friend thinks. That makes you his property until he gets proper compensation." Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. Mister, you just made a serious mistake. No woman is anyone's property, and threatening Miss Eleanor is a good way to get yourself shot. The tension in the small camp was explosive. Eleanor could see that Wright and his men were prepared for violence, while Jake was outnumbered but determined to protect her. Someone was about to get hurt, possibly killed, and it would be her fault for refusing to submit to Whitmore's demands. But then Eleanor noticed something that gave her hope. In the darkness beyond their camp, she could see more movement, more horsemen approaching. For a terrifying moment, she thought Wright had brought additional men, but as the figures came closer, she realized these newcomers weren't wearing the expensive gear of Whitmore's ranch hands. "Having a problem here, folks?" A familiar voice called out from the darkness. Eleanor's heart leaped as she recognized the speaker. It was Sheriff Williams from Silver Creek, along with 2 deputies. Someone had seen Wright and his men leaving town and had followed them, suspecting trouble. "Sheriff," Jake called out, relief evident in his voice. "These gentlemen were just leaving." Wright's face darkened with frustration, but he wasn't foolish enough to threaten violence with law enforcement present. "This isn't over," he said to Eleanor. "Mr. Whitmore is a patient man, but his patience has limits." As Wright and his men rode away into the darkness, Eleanor sank onto a log beside their fire, shaking with delayed fear. The confrontation had shown her just how far Whitmore was willing to go to get what he wanted. He wasn't just spreading rumors. He was prepared to use force and intimidation to break up her partnership with Jake. November brought unexpected changes to Silver Creek, starting with the arrival of a dusty rider on a tired horse who pulled up at the Morrison Matthews Ranch just as Eleanor was hanging laundry in the crisp morning air. "Ma'am," the young man called out, tipping his hat respectfully. "I'm looking for Miss Eleanor Matthews. Got word from Thomas Hartley that he's on his way back to Silver Creek." Eleanor's heart stopped, then began racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. After more than 2 years of silence, Thomas was finally coming home. The rider, a cowboy from the same outfit where Thomas and Jake had worked, delivered his message with the efficiency of someone accustomed to carrying important news across long distances. "Mr. Hartley's about 3 days behind me," the cowboy explained. "He sent me ahead to let you know he's coming and to find out." "Well, ma'am, he heard some confusing stories about your situation, something about a business partnership and trouble with a rich rancher from California. He wanted to make sure you were safe before he rode into town." Eleanor invited the messenger inside for coffee and a hot meal, her mind whirling with questions and emotions. Thomas was alive, well, and finally coming back to her. But what would he think of the choices she'd made? How would he react to learning about her partnership with Jake, her new independence, and the dangerous situation with Cornelius Whitmore? When Jake returned from checking the cattle that afternoon, Eleanor told him about the visitor and Thomas's impending arrival. She watched Jake's face carefully, trying to read his reaction to the news that would change everything between them. "That's wonderful, Miss Eleanor," Jake said, and his smile seemed genuine despite the complexity of the situation. "You've been waiting for him for a long time. He's a good man, and he'll be happy to see how strong and capable you've become." But Eleanor could see something else in Jake's eyes, a sadness he was trying to hide, a resignation that spoke of feelings he'd developed but would never express. Over the past months, their partnership had grown into something deeper than business, even though neither of them had acknowledged it directly. "Jake," Eleanor said carefully, "when Thomas arrives, we'll need to explain everything to him. The partnership, Whitmore's threats, all of it. He needs to understand what we've been dealing with." "Of course," Jake agreed. "And Miss Eleanor, whatever happens when Thomas gets here, I want you to know that these months have been the best of my life. Working alongside you, building something meaningful together, it's been more than I ever hoped for." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. She'd grown to care for Jake deeply. His steady presence, his unwavering support, his quiet strength had become the foundation of her new life. But Thomas was her first love, the man she'd waited for through 2 years of uncertainty and fear. 3 days later, just as the messenger had predicted, Thomas Hartley rode into Silver Creek. Eleanor spotted him from the front porch of the ranch house, and her heart leaped with joy and relief. He looked older, more weathered by his years of hard work, but he was still the same kind-hearted man who had courted her so gently before leaving to seek his fortune. Thomas dismounted and walked toward the house slowly, his eyes taking in the well-maintained ranch, the thriving cattle. And Eleanor herself, dressed in a practical work dress, her hair pinned up efficiently, looking nothing like the dependent young woman he'd left behind. "Eleanor," he said softly, stopping a few feet away from her. "You look different, stronger." "I am different," Eleanor replied honestly. "The past few months have changed me, Thomas. I hope you'll understand when you hear the whole story." Jake appeared from the barn, having seen Thomas's arrival. The two men studied each other carefully, Thomas seeing the man who had protected and partnered with the woman he loved, Jake seeing the man Eleanor had waited for through all their trials. "Thomas," Jake said, extending his hand. "It's good to see you again." Thomas shook Jake's hand, but his expression remained guarded. "Jake, I heard some troubling stories on my way here. Something about Eleanor being in danger, about a forced marriage." "Come inside," Eleanor said. "We have a lot to tell you." Over the next hour, sitting in the main room of the ranch house, Eleanor and Jake told Thomas everything. They explained about her father's debts, Cornelius Whitmore's arrangement, the business partnership that had saved Eleanor from an unwanted marriage, and the ongoing threats and intimidation they'd faced. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as he learned about the dangers Eleanor had faced. When they finished their story, he was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said finally, "I'm so sorry. If I'd known, if my letters had reached you." "It's not your fault," Eleanor assured him. "You couldn't have known about the problems with the mail service." Thomas turned to Jake, his expression serious but respectful. "Jake, I owe you more than I can ever repay. You protected Eleanor when I couldn't, gave her choices when she had none. I'll never forget that." "You don't owe me anything," Jake replied. "Eleanor saved herself. I just provided an alternative to a bad situation." But Thomas wasn't finished. "There's something else I need to tell you both. On my way here, I heard more than just stories about your troubles. I heard that Cornelius Whitmore is planning something big, some kind of final move to force Eleanor's compliance. Word is he's hired a group of men, not just ranch hands but real troublemakers, to come to Silver Creek and settle this matter once and for all." Eleanor felt a chill of fear. "When?" "Soon," Thomas said grimly. "Maybe within the week." "Eleanor, you're not safe here anymore. Whitmore has decided that if he can't have you willing, he'll take you by force." Jake's jaw tightened with determination. "Then we need to end this before he can make his move. I'm tired of running from threats and living under the shadow of that man's anger." "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor asked. "I'm suggesting we take the fight to him," Jake said. "But not with guns and violence. With the law and with truth." Over the next few days, the three of them worked together to develop a plan. Thomas revealed that during his travels, he'd gathered evidence of Whitmore's illegal activities, bribing officials, threatening competitors, using violence to get his way in business deals. Jake added his own observations of Whitmore's behavior and the testimony of ranch hands who had quit rather than participate in his questionable practices. Eleanor contributed her sharp mind for organization and strategy, putting together a comprehensive case that could be presented to federal marshals who had jurisdiction over Whitmore's interstate business activities. "The key is timing," Eleanor explained as they reviewed their evidence. "We need to present this information to the authorities before Whitmore makes his move against us. Once he's committed crimes in Colorado, we'll have local jurisdiction working with us instead of against us." Thomas looked at Eleanor with admiration. "You've really become a businesswoman, haven't you? The way you think through problems, organize information, it's impressive." Eleanor blushed at his praise but felt a complicated mix of emotions. Thomas's admiration was gratifying, but she also noticed that he seemed surprised by her capabilities, as if he'd expected to find the same dependent young woman he'd left behind. The plan worked better than they'd hoped. When federal marshals arrived in Silver Creek with warrants for Whitmore's arrest, they found not just a bitter old man seeking revenge, but evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior spanning multiple states. The hired troublemakers Whitmore had brought to intimidate, Eleanor found themselves facing federal charges instead of easy intimidation. Eleanor watched from the window of the general store as Whitmore was led away in handcuffs, his expensive clothes and arrogant manner unable to protect him from the consequences of his actions. She felt a deep sense of relief and satisfaction, not just because the threat was over, but because they'd won through intelligence and legal action rather than violence. That evening, as they celebrated their victory, Thomas made the proposal Eleanor had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "Eleanor," he said, taking her hands in his as they stood on the front porch of the ranch house, "I know everything has changed since I left. I know you've built a new life here, become independent and successful, but I still love you and I hope you'll still consider marrying me." Eleanor looked into Thomas's sincere face and felt her heart break a little. She did still care for him, the memories of their courtship, the dreams they'd shared. The faithfulness she'd maintained during his absence were all real and meaningful, but she also realized that she wasn't the same woman who had said goodbye to him 2 years ago. The trials she'd faced, the partnership with Jake, the independence she'd discovered, all of it had changed her in fundamental ways. "Thomas," she said gently, "I do still care for you, but I need you to understand that I'm not the same person I was when you left. I've learned that I'm capable of things I never imagined, and I've built a life that I'm proud of. Any marriage I enter now would have to be between equals, between partners who respect each other's abilities and dreams." Thomas nodded slowly. "I can see that, Eleanor, and I respect what you've accomplished. But surely we can find a way to build a life together that honors both your independence and our love." Before Eleanor could answer, Jake appeared in the doorway behind them.